this session tonight is the 6th in our webinar series focused on club crisis management. And this will be the second last in that series. The final session in our club crisis series will be next Wednesday evening. And that session will focus on infrastructure planning implications post COVID-19. Following next week's session, we'll be launching our next webinar series, which will focus on digital literacy for your club. Head to cprgroup.com.au/webinars to register for any or all of those upcoming webinars, which will take us into June. My name is Steve. I'm CPR Group's Director of Sport and Community Development. I get a real kick out of helping volunteers to be happier in their roles, and part of that happiness often comes from clubs getting new people involved to better share the workload. And that's going to be a key focus of our discussion this evening. Personally, I've filled a bunch of volunteer roles in my personal life, and I can confidently say in every single one of those cases, I've identified shortcomings in the way that clubs engage and interact with their volunteers, and also how those clubs engage with their wider membership in the interests of getting more people involved actively as helpers. Joining me this evening is Chris Kenwood, who's a senior consultant with CPR Group, senior in excellence and experience, not senior in age. Chris will act as moderator for the webinar, and I'll quickly throw to him now to explain the process of asking any questions during the session.
Thank you for that compliment, Steve. You're not normally as nice to me as that. We do like to make the webinars as interactive as we can, so we encourage people to post any questions that you have for us, which you can do by clicking on the Q&A button that you'll see on the left of your screen, and then just typing in the question. We will hopefully have time at the end of the session when Steve's finished presenting to answer those. If we haven't time at the end, then we'll certainly send you an email response tomorrow. And also be aware that nobody else sees the question that you type in there. So type in freely, as many questions as we can get, the better, and then hopefully we can address those and help you more through that process. Okay, Steve, back to you.
Thank you, Chris, and I'm very glad that you didn't have a jibe at me there about having enough time at the end of the session. There's a running joke internally here at the Group that I'm not going to be able to get any of these webinars done within our arbitrary 30-minute target. So let's see how we go tonight. Okay, so I want to start this evening's discussion with, as usual, a bit of a story. And tonight's story is centered around my Nana. Nana's name was Mari, and Mari was involved at a tennis club. She was involved as a volunteer, and this tennis club was in Pascoe Vale in Victoria. And on a typical Saturday morning, Mari might turn up to her tennis club, and she might be responsible for getting the facility ready for the day's play. So she might squeegee the courts because it's Pascoe Vale in Victoria, always raining. She might tighten the nets and get the playing facilities themselves ready for action. She might then head inside and tidy up in the club room from the evening's activities before Saturday morning, from the Friday evening's activities. She might clean the dunnies, she might stock the toilet paper and do some other general operational type tasks. And Mari would typically do all of those things because Mari was the club's treasurer. Now, that doesn't make sense in the real world for a person who fills a very specific strategic governance type role, one which is focused on ensuring the short-term and long-term financial viability of an organisation. It doesn't make a lot of sense for that same person to then be filling a whole bunch of operational roles. So in the real world, that sort of scenario doesn't make sense. But in the sport and recreation, community development, in the volunteer space, we see that all the time. Now, some of you might have chuckled, and when we're presenting sessions and telling stories like this face to face, there's always people who kind of turn to each other, the other attendee from their club, and say, "Oh gosh, yes, that sounds like our treasurer, or that sounds like our president." And it is a really common scenario in volunteer organisations. And a lot has changed in the world since 1969, yet not a lot in the volunteer world. So just because we're still doing things like that, and just because maybe that's the way that we've for many years done things in our volunteer organisations, and when I say that's the way, I refer to that overburdening of a very small group of volunteers in our organisation. Might be the management committee members who are also running the canteen and marking the lines through the week so they're ready for a weekend's play and so on. And this scenario doesn't need to be the way that we continue to do things just because that's the way we've always done it. More and more organisations now are realising that they're at a stage where they need to be drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, it's not reasonable for us to expect one person to do all of those jobs. Firstly, they're not going to be able to do a really good job of any of those things, potentially, if they're doing too much themselves, but also they're not going to really enjoy their involvement. These are people who are typically going to get burnt out. They're going to get sick of doing all of that work in their volunteer organisation, or more importantly, their spouse is going to get sick of it and tell them that they've got to stop. So we'll come back specifically to the sorts of things that are changing in the volunteering space very shortly. But firstly, let's begin with the end in mind. So we all want to be happy volunteers. Happy volunteers are those who get to spend exactly the amount of time that they want to spend in their volunteer role from one week to the next. And they get to spend all of that time doing only the volunteer work that they love. Now, again, there might be some chuckles amongst you, and that might be because you see this idea of happy volunteers as an unattainable goal. And as I've touched on, we see a lot of organisations that have, colloquially, as we refer to them, as the SEPs, or same eight people, who are the committee members. They're also the people filling all of those operational roles out there in the organisation. We've got very few people who are overworked and underpaid, and they're left to do everything. And often it's those people who put themselves into that situation by not divesting or delegating tasks to other people and holding things close to their chest, because if they give someone else the job, that person might not do as good a job as them. So I'm just going to keep doing everything myself. But at CPR Group, we truly believe that every volunteer can be a happy volunteer. And really, this is one of our fundamental adages, that we exist to create happier volunteers. Sure, we also exist as an organisation to help clubs and associations to run better businesses, but those businesses are nothing without their people. It's all about the people, and that's a bit of a theme that we'll come back to a little later in the discussion this evening too. So having happy volunteers, though, relies on several factors, and those include getting the volunteer structure right, engaging meaningfully with your members and the wider community to the extent that these people want to help, properly managing your volunteers so that they don't get lost in the system, and ensuring that people feel they're able to contribute real value. And I like to refer to these three fundamental principles of good volunteer management as structure, culture, and nurture. So who does it? Who volunteers? Well, in Australia over the last 10 years, quite a bit has changed. 10 years ago, so in 2010, the Australian Bureau of Statistics conducted a volunteering study which identified that more than 1/3, about 36% of Australia's adult population participated in formal volunteering with an organisation or group. So that's the sort of volunteering that we're talking about in the sport and community development sector. Given changes in the way that data is collected, current numbers are a little shaky. Now, whether or not formal volunteering has really decreased this much over the last 10 relatively short years, they've certainly felt pretty short, our work with volunteer organisations demonstrates, anecdotally at least, a sustained decline in a willingness to volunteer, a term often referred to as volunteerism. The good news is that the Australian Bureau of Statistics studies, several of which have been conducted in the last 10-year period, have consistently shown that the majority of Australia's volunteers work in sport and recreation organisations. So we're in the right space. Now, one of the big challenges with declining volunteerism is that it kind of comes at the same time that we're seeing the exact opposite happen in terms of the compliance and reporting requirements placed on volunteer organisations. So this is a graph that we often scribble up on a whiteboard with varying degrees of neatness. I often joke that I should have probably been a doctor because my handwriting and whiteboard scribbling is so messy. I certainly shouldn't have been a school teacher. Nevertheless, we use this graph as a bit of a visual prompt, if you like, to explain what we see as a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. So if you look at the x-axis, the line running along the bottom of your screen there, and you focus on the left-hand point, which we might assume could be, for argument's sake, 1981, when the Associations Incorporation Act was first released. And if we take our eyes over to the right-hand point on that x-axis and assume that that's 2020, so that's current day. In the time that a lot of your organisations will have been in existence, we've seen this declining volunteerism, which is represented by that blue line. And at the same time, we're seeing significant increases in the amount of reporting to the state government, whether it's the Office of Fair Trading for incorporated associations, whether it's child protection reporting and compliance obligations. It might be liquor licensing, gaming provisions, formal tenure associated with facility access, and so on. A lot of the bodies to whom our organisations report are typically being expected to provide more and more information, documentation, and proof of compliance to be able to continue to operate. So that's a big challenge when it comes at a time when we're seeing less people available to help out. It's not necessarily good or bad, it's just our playing field. We've got to be aware that that's the environment in which we're operating and take account of that in developing our strategies to combat that declining volunteerism. So why on earth do people volunteer? When we ask this question, we typically get responses similar to those listed in the results from studies about volunteering conducted by the ABS. These common responses are things like to help others or the community, to give back to an organisation that's helped them, personal satisfaction or family involvement, professional development, gaining new skills, work experience, and so on, and also social contact, which is really important, and we'll come back to that soon. But actually, we reckon that it's a bit simpler than that. Dale Carnegie, in his timeless bestseller, How to Win Friends and Influence People, wrote, "There is only one way under high heaven to get anybody to do anything, and that is by making the other person want to do it." So how on earth do we get people to want to volunteer with our organisation? That question brings us to the first of my three fundamental principles, which is structure. Firstly, we've got to get the structure right. We've got to create roles that have really neat parameters around them and that can be easily filled by volunteers. So this is often one of the first steps that we recommend when a president or a treasurer or one of those other key governance volunteers says, I'm doing everything. How do I get other people to help out? And we say, right, firstly, we need to identify and clearly articulate to your members that you're not doing one job. The president's job is not to be manning the canteen and to be marking the lines and to be picking up the cans after a Friday night's games. Those jobs are each individual roles that should be filled by separate people. If an individual volunteer who fills the position of president happens to have the time and the commitment and the willingness, and the spouse is happy to let them do all of those jobs, then that's great, and they can fill 4, 5 or more roles, as long as we let members know that that person is actually filling several roles. Because if others see that treasurer, president, whoever it might be, down at the club every single night, or most nights of the week and both days on the weekend, the likelihood of replacing that person in that role is pretty slim, and the likelihood of that individual getting burnt out is pretty high. So we've got to compartmentalize what that person or those same 8 people are doing, and create really easy to delegate jobs that we can give to different people, and set the parameters very clearly so that people understand exactly what is expected of them, how long they're going to be required to do that job for, and so on, and then start making those delegations to those individuals and activating them as volunteers in the organisation. Duty lists can help, but really prescriptive job descriptions can put people off and are often out of date as soon as they're published. So we often recommend to have a relatively succinct list of key considerations for each role. And this might be a little different for the governance roles, so the management committee positions. But for a good number of volunteer roles in an organisation, a simple list of, say, 5 to 10 important things that they've got to get done, and an indication as to how long they should be spending in that role, fits the bill in most cases. The next really important fundamental component of good volunteer management is having a great, well-engaged culture. Like almost everything in clubs and associations, culture is all about the people. Looking back to what Dale Carnegie said in his book, we need to create a culture within which people want to volunteer. How do we do this? There's no quick or easy solution, and when people ask us, what's one thing we can do to achieve a culture of positive volunteer engagement? Our answer, pointing back to some of those examples I've given earlier, is often get out of the canteen. And an example that we often give is, I'll use the name Cynthia in case people who are on tonight's webinar may well know this person from a large regional netball association in Queensland. So Cynthia, being her fictional name, in this association, loves spending time in the canteen, and she always has. She has been involved in this regional netball association for decades, and it's a generational involvement. So, her parents were involved before her and so on. And she loves to spend time in the canteen because she feels productive. She can sell some food, she can see the money from the purchase of that food going into the till and generating success today. But what she's not doing is producing capacity, the capacity of the organisation for tomorrow and for the longer term. So as I've touched on, the job of the president is not to be in the canteen. The job of the president is to be out there meeting people, schmoozing, if you will, making friends and truly connecting with them. Now, this goes for the president, but it also goes for other management committee members as well. So these committee members who are filling this important cultural role should be making these positive connections with members out there on the side of the netball court, beside the swimming pool, on the side of the football field, and asking about those members and what interests them about this sport and why are they involved, and ask about their kids and how long they've been playing the sport. And maybe those members in the first instance will be a little skeptical. They could be suspicious. Oh, what's this management committee member going to ask me to do now? They're buttering me up for some unknown reason. But don't ask them to do anything. Just make a friend, make a positive connection, and a meaningful relationship will begin to blossom. Then do it again in a few weeks and a few weeks after that. And it doesn't matter if you can't remember their name. It's okay to be honest and say, oh, I know we met a few weeks ago. Tell me, what's happened in the last couple of weeks in your son or daughter's team. And just make them feel really important. It's about planting the seed of a relationship and letting this grow naturally. And that will bring us to the nurture consideration, which we'll get to shortly. Then, when Cynthia is flustered one day and racing around, trying to get things done and get to the bank, and this person or several people who have had this really positive engagement with Cynthia over the past months or year sees Cynthia struggling, none of us want to see our friends suffer, so they'll stick their hand up and they'll help out. So this is the sort of culture building that will result in far more positive volunteer engagement. So what does this coronavirus-driven shutdown, and we're really conscious that people have been hearing COVID-19, coronavirus, lockdown, isolation, all these terms ad nauseum. So we're conscious that people are really keen to start moving on, and that presents a number of opportunities for us in the volunteer space. So, and note that I'm talking opportunities rather than challenges, which relates back to some of the positive mindset discussions that we've been having over the past couple of weeks in these webinars. But right now, people want to get out of the house. People are looking for any excuse to get out of the house. My wife hates grocery shopping, and she has been doing the grocery shopping for the last few weeks because it's an excuse to get out and about. The social isolation that has been forced upon us will inevitably, and I saw just today something from the Prime Minister about the mental health impacts of coronavirus, and I wasn't at all surprised to see that discussion has begun in earnest. And we've got to remember also that sport and volunteering is the way that a lot of people get their social engagement. For many people, they don't have anything else that is focused purely on socializing. They've got work, they've got their family, they've got kids. But for a lot of people, sport is their social engagement. And for others, volunteering is their social engagement. So we spoke a couple of weeks ago about the fact that your members are going to be potentially champing at the bit to get out there and might be more keen now than they have in previous times to provide some valuable volunteer labour for the club. But consider also that each of your organisations is situated in a community, and in some cases even a relatively tight-knit neighbourhood. So while we wouldn't ordinarily recommend a letterbox drop, that sort of activity in this environment, especially given that we're starting to hear now about restrictions being lifted here in Queensland, we'll be able to get out and about for more reasons from this weekend. And that comes at a time when people are really just itching to get out. So perhaps a great volunteer drive could be for members of your club, existing volunteers, to get out and pound the pavement, go for a walk with the family and do a letterbox drop. Drop some flyers into all the letterboxes in your local community. It's a great way to capitalise on the fact that inevitably there will be people out there who are still in this frame of mind of what can I do to help? People might not have a lot of extra money to contribute, acknowledging the economic impact that this crisis has had on society, but maybe people are keen to help in other ways. And a pretty flyer dropped into letterboxes could clearly state the sort of help you're looking for. It shouldn't be vague. It should be very clear in its explanation of the things that you want help with, and provide key information like you don't need to be a member to volunteer with us. You don't need to be into football to help out. We need help with these sorts of jobs: canteen, maintenance around the club, game day setup and pack up. Maybe 10 things, and a good range of things to pique the interest of a different cohorts of people. And that little flyer, the little letterbox pamphlet, could even be the same document that people tick and flick, and then you could ask them to drop it back into your club's letterbox on a family walk of their own. So also, obviously, you're not going to miss the opportunity to take that pretty flyer that you pulled together and post it to social media as well. And obviously, that's a great way to be engaging in this period of social isolation. But we also really love the idea of maybe making some promises, whether it's through this flyer letterbox drop approach or on social media alone or via both mediums. Make some promises, and this applies to potential new volunteers in the community as well as your members. So things like, we promise to never make you do anything other than what you want to do. We promise we won't throw you in the deep end. We promise to value your contribution. We promise you'll get an opportunity to talk to people, to feel valued, to make new friends, and some friends who might become lifelong friends. So promote that your club's a great way to connect and to make meaningful relationships. Finally, then, we've got to nurture our volunteers. I often get asked the question, how do we stop our volunteers from getting burnt out? Well, share the workload. Okay, but how else can we keep volunteers engaged? We've tried lots of reward and recognition activities, and people still it's like a revolving door. My very clear answer is always, the best way to keep a volunteer is for that volunteer to feel truly valued, to feel as though they're actually contributing proper value to your organisation. I was having a discussion only shortly prior to the lockdown period being imposed with Courtney, one of our staff, and she volunteers at a local arts gallery. And she was explaining that she's probably not likely to keep doing so for too much longer, because she turns up to her volunteer role and is often left looking for things to do because, there's too many people filling the same sort of role. So as soon as people are left floundering, as soon as there's not really clear parameters around what's expected of people, then you're at risk of losing them. So one of the ways to keep volunteers well engaged once you've got them and to nurture that relationship is to have a dedicated contact person. Now, it might be the case that you've got a volunteer coordinator who's the contact person for everyone. Or you might have different people who are volunteer coordinators and the contact people for people in different types of roles. Regardless of how you do it, it's absolutely vital that once you've got a volunteer, once you've got someone who's taken the time to put their hand up and say, yes, I'm going to help out, that relationship is nurtured. And that, micromanagement in the volunteer world, whilst it's an absolute no-no in an employment setting in most instances, in the volunteer space, micromanagement is your friend. Give people very specific tasks, very clear timeframes, and very clear instructions and expectations as to what you want them to do or what the club wants them to do. Because as soon as people, like I say, are left floundering and feeling as though they're not contributing real value, the risk that they're going to leave increases. Okay, Chris, I'll throw back to you. I've seen a couple of questionnaires coming in there.
Yep. One that's very much directly related to Steve, is there any chance the CPR group has a copy of a volunteer flyer for a letterbox drop that we could circulate? Do you want to take that one? I think I know the answer, but
So we don't have a template, but it's the sort of thing that we would certainly be really happy to pull together collaboratively with an organisation, and the sorts of inclusions that I've mentioned tonight are certainly the things that would be great to have on there. If the person who asked that question or anyone else would like to talk through that with us in more detail, feel free to just leave a note in the Q&A box there, and we'll touch base tomorrow to talk further about that.
Yeah, we'll contact the person who's answered that question and maybe put some notes together that will maybe we can share with the others afterwards. Another question we've got is, what sort of time commitment should we expect from each volunteer?
Okay, so as I said earlier, the definition, so to speak, of a happy volunteer is one who spends, or they spend exactly the amount of time in their volunteer role from one week to the next, and they spend all that time doing exactly what they want to do. Now, Chris might be really happy to spend 8 hours in a volunteer role as a football coach, which is his background, in his club every single week because he loves the sport, he's played his whole life and wants to give something back. I might want to flip burgers once a year. And while the amount of time that we're each contributing is very, very different, nevertheless, that's what we want to provide. That's the amount of time that we want to spend. So we're always very cautious about, putting an exact number or even a guideline. You should expect between this and this number of hours each week from your volunteers, and rather we say work with your volunteers and identify with them collaboratively how long they want to spend and identify the sorts of things that they are interested in doing, because those people who feel that fulfillment and are indeed happy in their roles because they're doing what they want for how long they want, they're the people that you're going to hold on to for the longer term. Good question.
Yeah. Okay, got another one just come in now. So is offering volunteers a reduction on their fees something that should be considered? This club, like a lot of clubs, struggle to get either coaches or committee members each year. So is a reduction in fees or some sort of financial benefit something that a club should consider?
Many clubs do, and there are lots of different ways that can be done. So it might be indeed a fee reduction. It might be, reducing the fees in the following year for that player if it's a player coach, or for that parent's child if they're the one that's coaching. And again, whilst we've seen varying degrees of success with systems like this, sometimes it works really well. Typically, it takes quite a bit of management. So, to identify, particularly if it's, if you provide 5 hours of support in the volunteer, you'll get a $50 levy back, for example. That's a really complicated system to manage because you've got to have essentially a clock on, clock off system in the canteen, and someone to then manage that and tally it and identify who gets their money back. And it also brings with it the reimbursable volunteer levy consideration brings with it a need to identify that money that comes in at the start of the season as volunteer levy, not as income, rather as a liability, because everyone could earn their volunteer levy back. So where we're talking about a fee reduction for very set volunteer roles such as coaches, then that's typically where we see it work more successfully. But again, the magnitude of that discount, how many people you're offering the discount to, all needs to take account of your budgetary considerations so that you don't put your club into financial difficulty by offering those discounts. Finally, then, on that answer, the other thing that we're seeing, to go right back to the start of the discussion and that drawing of a line in the sand, we're seeing more and more organisations simply pay people to fill the roles that they struggle to find volunteers to fill, and they simply add a little bit of extra on to the fees to cover that employment engagement. So that's moving more towards the commercialised model of sport delivery that we see in other countries, and it's not suitable for every club, but certainly one that we've seen implemented successfully in some cases. Another good question.
Something to that, because I think it's a good point that's raised by that question, and whether fee reduction for people that volunteer for coaching or for committee positions, I think you really need to ask yourself a question beforehand, and that is, will this be effective? If the reason that you can't get volunteers to coach or to sit on the committee is because people are paying fees and they're contributing enough, then a reduction may work. If, however, they're not volunteering because they don't have time, or because they don't like the culture at the club, or they feel that certain people are not happy, not the sort of people they want to work with, then giving them money back on their fees isn't going to make that any better. So really try to identify why you think that you're struggling to get those volunteers. And if you think it's financial, then by all means try a discount, but really try to identify the why first, I think.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this is a great question, and certainly one close to your heart, Chris, because I'm sure you've been involved in plenty of clubs yourself that have been toying with this idea.
And I've seen clubs offer discounts on fees. I'm at soccer clubs that I'm familiar with, and it still hasn't made any difference to the number of volunteers next year, because it wasn't the money that was causing the problem. So, okay. We had a question on volunteer levies, but I think you've probably touched on that, Steve, and that's probably the sort of summary of the questions that I have now.
Good. Excellent. Thank you very much for passing on those questions, and thanks to those who submitted those queries. We'll leave the webinar running for a few moments once we're done, and if there are any other questions floating around in your head, feel free to pop them into that Q&A field. The report that the webinar generates gives us a copy of all of those questions, and we'll be happy to get back to you tomorrow. So that brings us to the end of this evening's session. And look, Chris, it's only 7:06. So we are really appreciative for everyone attending tonight's webinar and all of our webinars in this Club Crisis Management series. For that reason, we're offering an extended free 6-month trial to Asset Track, which is our asset management and asset maintenance tool online. And if you're interested in checking that out, head to Asset Track, which is TRAC, as per that middle logo on your screen, .com.au, and register for a free trial. We'll do a matchup of your trial registration with the attendee list, and we'll extend your trial for 6 months. And we'll also be keeping in touch with you to make sure that you're getting the most out of the system. CPR Group is also the developer of Meeting Track, which is an online meeting tool, and it makes the task of preparing and running meetings far easier for your secretary. So if you're interested in checking that out, head to meetingtrack.com.au. We're also encouraging everyone to sign up for our newsletter. We've got some really good stuff going out there regularly, stuff of relevance. We're not just, particularly in this coronavirus period, we're not just rehashing stuff that we're seeing put out from the government. It is all stuff of relevance to volunteer clubs and associations. And we're also very, very happy always to take any questions through our contact us form on our website. So thanks again for turning up. We look forward to seeing you back online next Wednesday evening for our final webinar in this session, and then following that, our Digital Literacy for Clubs webinar series. Look forward to seeing you then.